In 2003, shortly after mission accomplished banners were displayed behind President Bush as he declared major combat operations in Iraq to be over, the administration found itself in hot water after leaking the name of Valerie Plame, an undercover CIA agent, to the media.
The year was 2003. By June, America had been at war for 4 months searching for the leader of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, and his supply of weapons of mass destruction that could have made himself and his nation a threat to the world and the United States. By June, the American public were becoming skeptical of George W. Bush and his administration's notions for going into Iraq in the first place. News outlets were reporting that American forces had yet to find any sign of WMDs in the locations where intelligence community officials thought they would be. With the citizens of his nation losing interest and becoming angry, President Bush stepped to the microphone on a hot June evening and gave a State of the Union address that would place the first of many black eyes on his administration.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
With this remark, the president had set off a firestorm of attacks on the First Amendment, lies, and leaks. There was no leak more famous than administration officials who leaked the name of a CIA operative who happened to be the wife of a former U.S. ambassador to Africa.
When you heard the remarks of the president in his State of the Union address, were you listening to it when it was?
I was, yes.
What was your reaction when you heard those remarks live?
I assumed that the country to which the president was referring was not Niger.
Joseph Wilson wrote that the vice president's office had raised questions about this alleged Niger uranium deal, and that the CIA had asked him to look into it. He said that he found no evidence of a deal.
A misstatement of fundamental fact which supported the justification for the invasion of a sovereign nation was in the President's State of the Union address. This administration failed to correct the record.
Wilson decided to correct the record himself. First, he agreed to talk confidentially to 2 reporters.
I had not wanted my name used in this. It was not to hide my own role from my own government, but rather to make sure that all their attack dogs did not get an early opportunity to try and trash me.
So why did you decide to go public?
Because it became apparent in June that the administration was just going to continue to stonewall.
Can you explain how an erroneous piece of intelligence on the Iraq-Niger connection got into your State of the Union speech, and should somebody be held accountable, sir?
I gave a speech to the nation that was cleared by the intelligence services.
5 days after Wilson's op-ed, the CIA took responsibility for not removing the faulty claim from Bush's speech.
But, sir, how did it get into your speech that was erroneous?
Days later, conservative columnist Robert Novak came out with his own column. Novak contradicted the impression that Cheney had been responsible for Wilson's trip to Niger, writing that 2 Bush administration officials said Wilson had been sent at the suggestion of his wife, CIA operative Valerie Plame.
For an administration that came to office,
Wilson was all over the news,
senior officials in the White House,
charging the White House with outing his wife, an undercover CIA officer,
it's just gratuitous. It is a gratuitous smear.
to punish him for his dissent.
So this was hardball politics, basically.
It's something they're well known for, absolutely.
Wilson suspects the leak was deliberate, a reprisal for his challenge of
The story played as a potentially devastating scandal for the White House,
The Bush White House is facing a potential criminal investigation.
revealing Plame's identity to the press may have been a violation of the law.
The prosecutors and agents who are and will be handling this investigation are career professionals.
The Justice Department was called on to open a leak investigation.
Matters involving sensitive national security information.
Karl Rove, President Bush's chief of staff, Scooter Libby, the vice president's chief of staff, and Vice President Dick Cheney himself were all the suspects of leaking the identity of Valerie Plame to the press. The scandal was strong enough to impeach the president.
If somebody did leak classified information, I'd like to know it.
John Ashcroft, the U.S. Attorney General, was chosen to lead the leak investigation before outraged Democrats in Congress and members of the press felt that it was a conflict of interest for Ashcroft to lead an investigation in a president that appointed him. In comes Patrick Fitzgerald, a former prosecutor from the state of Illinois who was known as a tough and nonpartisan, was chosen by President Bush to take over the investigation. The media's hope for a new person to lead the investigation would eventually come to haunt them. Along with Novak, Times' Matthew Cooper, and New York Times' Judith Miller were subpoenaed by Fitzgerald and asked to give up their anonymous sources, to which they replied they'd rather go to jail. Cooper was because of a story he had written 5 years prior called A War on Wilson, in which he had said government officials spoke about the identity of Plame as a CIA official. Miller, on the other hand, never wrote a story. Fitzgerald felt she had enough information that would help lead him to find the leak.
Because it's a journalist's job in society to cover the news and be a watchdog for the people, one of the questions that remained hidden during the Plame affair was whether a journalist should have the right to not testify in order to protect their sources.
I am a citizen of the United States. I do want to obey the law. But the problem is under our laws are whole categories of people who are exempt from appearing before grand juries. And these include people like doctors, lawyers who don't have to testify about what their clients tell them, clergy people who don't have to reveal what their parishioners tell them, spouses who don't have to reveal what their husbands or wives tell them, and as of 1996, psychotherapists and social workers, whom the courts decided really should also be covered by the exemption because it's important that people feel they should be able to get help if they need help. What the paper and I are arguing, and what 49 states have basically ruled and agreed with us on, is that journalists, too, have a very specific and important function in society, and that is as the people who kind of live day to day the First Amendment, who help bring the public news. And that in order to do that, we rely heavily on confidential sources, and therefore, in order to do our jobs, we have to be able to protect the people who come to us with sensitive and potentially dangerous information for them and for their careers. And 49 states have said, yes, these people should be exempt from appearing before grand juries, some of them in qualified situations, and others, like the great state of New York, in which I live, and in the District of Columbia, in which I work, have decided that that ought to be an absolute protection. So we're not asking to be above the law. We're asking for the federal law to catch up with what the states have done and to provide journalists the protection I think we need in order to bring the public news.
Bluff or no bluff, Cooper and Miller were forcing the question. Would the courts back their decision not to testify?
My standard for cooperation was very high. It was different from other people's. Everybody has to make that call themselves, but I knew what I could live with and what I couldn't live with.
Judy Miller's attitude about this was that it was important for at least someone to stand up and fight, even if she wound up losing.
The reporters did lose. The Supreme Court refused to hear the case, and the final word was left with a lower court.
The appellate court in that case spoke directly, spoke very, very clearly, and said Brandsburg stands.
That's what they said. There's no ambiguity at all, that there is no protection, the Court of Appeals in Washington said, for journalists in situations in which a grand jury seeks information in good faith from a journalist, period.
Is it possible that given the bad facts in this case, and given the decision to, in a sense, fight this on principle, that in the end what you did was make bad law?
It's possible. It's possible.
You got the appellate court to reaffirm Brandsburg, which Goodale and your friend Goodale and allies have been trying to avoid a decision like that for decades.
Yeah. It just seems to me that there are some fights which have to be fought, and sometimes they have to be fought even if chances of winning are slight.
Even after Fitzgerald worked out a deal with the possible suspects in the White House that allowed the newspapers to reveal their names to the grand jury, Miller and Cooper refused on the basis that it would not only affect their publication's reporting and relationships with sources for years to come, but it would be in violation of their constitutional rights as members of the press. Cooper's editor would eventually surrender his notes after being subpoenaed, a controversial decision that invited scorn from many fellow journalists. Unlike Cooper, Miller was in sole possession of her notes. Thus, the decision of whether to testify or not was solely hers, and she opted not to.
In the end, Scooter Libby was convicted on 4 counts of perjury and obstruction of justice, but the primary leakers, Richard Armitage and Karl Rove, were not charged. On July 6, 2005, Judith Miller went to jail for 12 weeks to protect her source. Miller left the Times later that year.
The fight for protection for confidential sources took a hit, as the courts ruled against Miller and Cooper, and Congress has yet to pass a shield law. This affair was certainly not a shining moment in journalism's history, but yet it didn't leave a black mark either. In many ways, it was simply a snowballing situation, blown out of proportion by lying officials and journalists who had sworn to protect their identities.